Thank you so much, Anu. And it's wonderful hearing all the voices. And I think it's one of the few instances where voices from the global south talking about a decolonial project are all together. I was asked, when I was thinking about, I thought I'll bring in India's position. And I think I'll come in from the standpoint of India. And I think to start the story, and I think that's where many of the voices would converge also. I think one of the key question is the question of label: feminist foreign policy or a gender responsive foreign policy? And I think this question is important if you're thinking about India's position, because India is very hesitant to use the label of feminist foreign policy. And I think I've been thinking about this question, and I think it's important to reflect on this question from the standpoint of location. And if you're looking at a country like India, and I think this is something which would speak to us in the global south, the question of genealogy of feminist foreign policy becomes extremely important. And I think why I'm talking about this question of feminist foreign policy, and I'm going to just, bring in the voice of the External Affairs Minister of India, who in 2021 states, I agree that we need to look at the world from the perspective of women. We need a gender balanced foreign policy. We need to look at three things here: getting more women to engage with foreign policy issues, reflect on women's interests in foreign policy, and bring in a feminist perspective to foreign policy. He went on to acknowledge the need for rebalancing in India's foreign policy, but emphasized, and I underline that, but emphasized that any such policy cannot simply be imported from countries in the West, as these countries have different cultures, different historical traditions, and we need to evolve a framework that is organic, that organically speaks to India. And I think it's here that I'm coming back in to the question of semantics or label. And I think I do want to emphasize that when we are thinking about this politics of label, there are two D's that we need to be thinking about. One is dialogue and the other is difference. And I think Radhika very beautifully, talked about how we are in dialogue with some of the norms that are coming in from the global north, especially centered around the ideas of human security, but we are also in diffidence and indifference. And I think I want to come back to the question of difference. Now, if you're looking at the question of genealogy of feminist foreign policy and the politics of location, I think states, post colonial states like India, would be very hesitant because there is a very rich history in the context of the ideas of feminist politics and the way it has translated in the realm of foreign policy. And I think if you're looking at the way the current genealogy of feminist foreign policy is projected, with it centered around the global north, I think it's more about the idea of exclusions than inclusions. And I think it's here that we need to come back and see a rich history or a rich trajectory or a rich genealogy of India's engagement with both feminist ethics and feminist principles. And if I go down into history, I think what is important really is that if you're thinking about a gender sensitive foreign policy, or if you're thinking about a feminist foreign policy, we need to first problematize the genealogy itself. So if I go down into the context of plural histories, I do want to talk about the feminist strategic thought, which actually goes back to 6th century BC in a text called Therigatha. Now, the Therigatha is a very interesting text. If I look at the Therigatha as a text, it was written by the Buddhist monks, the first Buddhist monks who were women, who were called the Theris, and the ideas of relationality and a non hierarchical world order and ideas of feminist utopia were embedded in this history way back in the 6th century BC. So, how do we actually turn around and talk about a genealogy which is very modern and centered around the 6th century idea? How do we talk about a genealogy that is centered around the global north? So this is a slippery terrain. And why it is a slippery terrain is because I also want to highlight that this ideas of a post-colonial, decolonial project can also be appropriated by by the populist radical right in the global south. So this is a very thin, slippery terrain that we are walking through when we are talking about the politics of genealogy and histories in the global south, particularly in India. Now, if I talk about it in the current context and going on and building on my point on how India has really embraced the idea of feminist ethics and principles without embracing the terminology of feminist foreign policy, I'm going to echo what Professor Chinoy was talking about. Since 1947, India has been talking about the ideas of non alignment. It's been talking about the context of multilateralism. It has been talking about the whole context of a non hierarchical world order. And this has been through the 1940s, 1950s. We are seeing the current ramification of it, for instance, in the context of India's position in terms of not aligning with either sides of the blocks that we are talking about. So I think the key point is we need to pay attention to how states are embracing feminist ethics and principles and tracing them down to their own feminist histories and genealogy. And I think that's an important question. And I think what it would also push for is to problematize the idea of universalism that is embedded in the three R's that we are talking about. The second point that I want to draw attention to is the question of state self identity. And I think the question of state self identity is extremely important. If you look at the way the framing in the global north is, the framing has been ideas around moral exceptionalism, something which Sweden is talking about, or many of the other countries in the global north, even Germany to a great extent. But if you come back to India and its post colonial identity, I think it's again very attentive to how it constructs its idea of state identity. And now, in the case of India, this is deeply rooted in its post colonial experience and the politics of civilization and modernity. Now, India is acutely attentive, and I want to underline this, India is acutely attentive to how the West inscribes India and how discursively India produces its own self identity. Now, this is where, if you're looking at the label of feminist foreign policy, a post colonial state like India is very hesitant to deploy an exported or an outwardly oriented template of feminist foreign policy. And this is really pertinent because it also has this whole context of how, despite this strategic hesitancy, there is a push to embrace the idea of gender responsive foreign policy. And I think if you're looking at it, the push that I'm trying to underline is that if you're talking about a cross cutting regional dialogue, we need to push for a decolonial, cosmopolitan thinking on ideas of feminist foreign policy, something that Patricia was also talking about. So I'm going to echo that. The third important point that I thought I'm going to talk about is the synergy. And I think this is where feminist foreign policy in the global south has a huge lacunae. The synergy is in the context of cross cutting inter-regional dialogue. And when I say cross-cutting inter-regional dialogue, I also want to emphasize on the point of the need for intra-regional dialogue. So for instance, how would ideas on if you're talking about, Radhika was talking about economic decolonization, cultural decolonization, and political decolonization. Now, if I'm looking at three literal contexts in South Asia itself, Maldives, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, there is a lot of synergy in the context of economic decolonization that we are talking about. If you're looking at India and Nepal, there's a lot of synergy in the context of political decolonization that we are talking about. But I think platforms for engagement on inter-regional and intra-regional feminist solidarity networks stand very minimal as opposed to the WPS agenda that we were talking about and the synergy that the WPS agenda was able to push. So I think in that context, I would really say that the road ahead is long, but it's important to take cognizance of perspectives of states like India, where post-colonial identities continue to play a role in terms of both its dialogue and dissidence to the idea of feminist foreign policy. I'll stop there.